Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight on a mixed bag of weather for sure. I know there were some power outages, so thankfully those of you joining us aren't experiencing that tonight. On behalf of the Kalamazoo area chapter of Wild Ones, we're excited to welcome you to tonight's presentation. I'm your host, Jason Ballou. I'm the Vice President and Membership Chair of our chapter. For those of you who are new to Wild Ones, we're a nonprofit membership organization. Our vision is to restore and sustain biodiversity through education and the practice of landscaping with native plants. As you can see on the slide, we are currently having a spring membership drive. So through April 26th, we're having this spring membership drive. So all new and renewing members will receive a free copy of Nancy and Tom Small's book, Using Native Plants to Restore Community. It's a lovely book with extensive research. The membership drive is retroactive to January 1st. So for those of you who joined to date in 2023, you'll also receive a copy. The books can be picked up in person at our April programming meeting on April 26th at the Portage District Library. You can find out more information about that on our website at kalamazoo-wildones.org. Also, be sure to mark your calendars for our 9th annual Community Native Plant Sale on May 20th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. at People's Food Co-op. As most of you know, this is our biggest fundraiser of the year. We have some really exciting new plant offerings to share with you. You might have read about some of them in our Seedlings newsletter. But I'd like to give a special shout out to our major sponsor, Native Connections. And you can find more information about the spring plant sale, including sponsorship opportunities, under the programs and events page of our website. Lastly, just a few housekeeping items. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel, where you can find this and all of our other previous presentations. We're going to keep everyone muted during the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, just use the chat button. We'll gather all the questions and then ask Mike, our speaker, to answer as many of the questions as possible at the end of the presentation. For best viewing, you can set your view mode to speaker instead of gallery. And during slide sharing, choose the side-by-side viewing mode at the top of your screen. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ruth to introduce Mike.
Hello and good evening, everyone. I hope you're not being affected too much by the current ice storm. It's not very good down here in South Portage. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Mike Weis. He is co-owner of Dropseed Native Gardens and Ecological Restoration. It is really nice to have some more people in that field in this area, and we are very glad that he has done that. Part of his knowledge came from knowing Chad Hewson and helping Chad at Hidden Savanna. So we're expanding. Mike's been working with native plants since 2005, and he is also a steward of Kleinstuck Preserve and a board member. He also volunteers with Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy. I'm very glad to have him as a member of the Kalamazoo organization. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Unmute. All right, thank you. All right, thanks for having me do this. This is great. I've sat in on quite a few presentations via Zoom for Wild Ones and learned a lot, especially last month's with Kim. That was a fantastic presentation. So I have a lot to get through on this presentation, so I'm just going to jump in and talk about the title, Designing Native Plant Gardens. I think of the entire process of creating a native plant garden as the design. So the prep work, the choosing of plants, creating the design I do it on a computer. Some people do it on a blueprint. the installation of the plants as well as the management. I think of that whole process as design because it's not a large restoration project. It's usually the gardens I'm working on are yards. So a lot of detailed intent, and it really needs to be kind of massaged all the way through. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about designing. And then the subtitle, minimizing the air and trial and error. I kind of want to clarify that a bit as well, because error kind of implies that there was a mistake that was made. And since there are many different applications for native plant gardens, I think that, one gardener's error might be, or a mistake might be another gardener's success story. So it all depends on what your goals are for your garden. And I think it's really important to kind of state your goals beginning before you start the whole process, so you can see if things have gone well and what needs to be tweaked along the way. I also want to mention that I think trial and error is a good thing. I don't want to badmouth it too much, because I think that's a great way for us to learn. These gardens are fluid, they're dynamic, they're a living landscape. So things are going to be moving around, they're going to be changing. The relationships between these plants are not completely defined. So it really requires a lot of observation and along the way. So that's kind of what I think about. It's always going to be, you're going to be improvising and experimenting. So trial and error is definitely part of the process. With that said, I would like to say that though, there are many mistakes that I made along the way, and mistakes that I see other people make that really are kind of, if you can avoid them, it would save you a lot of heartache and time and money. Some basic ones that really can set back a project. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to focus specifically on one garden. It's the first garden that I ever installed, which is what you're looking at right here. This is our home garden in Chicago. We started this garden in 2005, and I moved to Kalamazoo in 2020. So that's 15 years of living with this garden, working with it, managing it, observing it, being completely mystified by it and amazed by it. So, and the good thing is I documented it really well. So there's a lot of photos that we could, I had in my stockpile to show the entire process, and just a lot of ways of things that went well and things that didn't go so, and it's all kind of shown here in photos. So let's kind of get into that. Photo was taken in 2010, 5 years after we did the installation. This is me with my son, who is now 14 years old. Oops. Can't move on to the next slide like I usually can. Oh, there we go. That was interesting. Anyways, okay, this photo here on the right is my wife cutting the grass for the first time shortly after we moved into the house. This yard is kind of a typical sized city lot. It's pretty small. The only thing that's kind of odd about it is that the house was set far back on the property, so we didn't have a backyard. We had a front yard to work with. And with that in mind, our goals might be slightly different than someone who has a backyard where you kind of have free reign to let things kind of go wild, let the asters and goldenrods just reseed like nuts. But in the front yard, we had our, we wanted it to be ecologically functional as well as aesthetically pleasing. So this street that we're on is high traffic. The sidewalk has got a lot of foot traffic. I wanted to make sure that the garden that we put in here was going to be beautiful wasn't going to be an eyesore. I wasn't going to get hassles from the neighbors. So that was part of our goals. So with that said, these are the goals here on the left. And basically, these are kind of the goals I have in mind whenever I create any garden. I tweak it a bit, but generally speaking, this is what I'm trying to do when I'm trying to set up a native plant garden. Increase biodiversity, increase bird and pollinator habitat, reduce noise and pollution, and sequester carbon. That's really important for this property because this street is Kedzie Avenue. It's really busy with traffic. During rush hour, we get a lot of bumper to bumper traffic. So these cars are sitting in exhaust and it's kind of spewing into our yard and into our house. So I had the idea of creating a really nice buffer, not with a fence. I wanted to do it with plants to kind of soak up that all that pollution, and plants do a great job at that, and they convert it into oxygen and they sequester that carbon. And so conserve water. This lawn that you're looking at does a terrible job. We get really terrible storm run off during heavy rains, and that's a big problem, especially in Chicago, where we have kind of an archaic plumbing system in there. And when that gets overloaded, they have problems with the stormwater backing up into people's basements. So the city of Chicago had an incentive program, I don't know if they still do, where they're trying to get people to create native plant gardens and rain gardens to offset this, that it became such a problem. Because lawns have tiny roots systems, so they're not doing more than just looking like outdoor carpet, basically. I feel like I don't need to talk too much about lawns. It's kind of preaching to the choir, but I just want to say that, you know, they don't really have much of a function. In fact, they kind of create a lot of other problems with pollution, runoff from fertilizers and pesticides, and all sorts of things. So let's move on from there. Improve soil quality, reduce yard maintenance, create a self-sustaining, resilient plant community, create a beautiful, interesting yard, be a positive ambassador for the native plant garden movement, make it fabulous and simple enough so future owners don't destroy it. I think about this last one all the time, especially now now that I'm creating gardens for customers. You know, we put a lot of time and passion and money and effort into creating these gardens. They're looking great, but you know, how long are we going to stay at these residencies? So when we sell them, what's going to happen to them once we move on? And I want them to stick around. I don't want the next owner to return it back to this monoculture. And how do we do that? We need to make it look really good, especially if we're working in the front yard. And in addition to making it aesthetically really beautiful, we need to make them make the maintenance to be really low maintenance and have it to be pretty much a self-sustaining process. And that's not entirely an easy thing to do. When I first started this, everyone said there's barely any maintenance to native plant gardening. Well, I feel like, you know, I traded in my my lawnmower for my weed pulling. So I did a lot of weed pulling, and we're going to get into that. And there was a reason why, and it doesn't have to be that bad. So oh, that's right, it doesn't do that. Here we are, 2003 on the left. This is shortly after we bought the house, with the for sale signs are nailed to the catalpa trees. So this is kind of a typical yard you see kind of all over America, where, you know, you might have these, you know, mature native trees as the canopy. And in this case, we had 5 catalpa trees. They're pretty at the northern range, I think. They're more of a southern species. But anyways, we have these catalpa trees here, and then, you know, it's very typical. Then you'll usually have a monoculture of lawn and some Japanese yews, maybe at the foundation. So we didn't want to own land and have it look like this and not serve any sort of, address any sort of any environmental problem. In fact, it's creating environmental problems. So we put effort into it, and a few years later, this is what we got. It's a lot more ecologically functional. I think it's more beautiful to look at. It's a lot more interesting to walk through, that's for sure. So I can't remember, this one's probably 4 years after install. I can't remember how long, but anyways, so it wasn't all that easy down the road because of the mistakes I made early on. And right at the beginning, I made some big mistakes that pretty much haunted us for the rest of our time living at this house because, well, let's get into the preparation here. So the prep phase is not a very glamorous phase of creating a garden. It's not very exciting, but it's absolutely essential to do it properly, because if you don't do it right the first time, you're going to be dealing with a lot of weeds for many years down the road. And that's what happened here. And the main thing you don't want to do during the prep phase, you don't want it to disturb the soil too much. And I went the exact opposite, and I violently disturbed this soil. You know, back then, this is 2005, there was tons of information about how to create these kind of gardens. So we referred to, we went to the library and referred to those traditional gardening books that have step-by-step ways, you know, of advice of how to create gardens and what to do. And I think those books are a mess in terms of advice. And I think you should just toss all those books out, because every advice that I followed, I feel like those were all the mistakes I made in creating this garden. They mentioned the best way to prep a yard is to rototill it. You know, that's what was very common. You know, that might work for if you're going to try to create crops or edible gardens, but you don't want to do that in these kind of landscapes. We borrowed my father-in-law's rototiller and tore up the yard. The good thing is it works quickly. You got the sod removed really fast, but then what the problem is, you completely disturb the seed bank. You opened up the soil to all sorts of pioneering species, that weed species that are gonna just inhabit quickly, and they surely did. The next step that they recommend is amending the soil. You see that all the time. All this advice of, you know, people talk about good and bad soil, that you need really nice, rich black soil. Native plants do not need that. In fact, most plants don't need that. You know, the soil for your landscape shouldn't be like potting soil. If that's what you're going for, you're going to have a lot of problems. Weeds love that kind of soil. A lot of plants can't even survive in that rich of soil. We amended the soil with some compost that we got at just, you know, the nursery up the street. Rototilled it in. Bad idea. The soil didn't need amending by any stretch of the imagination. If, you know, I've looked back on what the pre-settlement maps were of this area, and they were mostly mesic prairies in this part of the city. So the soil is pretty rich to begin with. Then we made it even more rich by rototilling it and amending it with compost. I don't believe you don't really need to amend the soil. I mean, there's maybe really extreme cases where you might have had some construction traffic that did some massive compaction to the soil, or maybe your yard was a dumping ground at some point, but I've never amended soil. I feel like that there's so many different plant communities, and there's a plant community for every type of soil, and there's loads of plant lists for all those communities. Right now I'm working with a lot of dry soil here in Kalamazoo. And, you know, my friends in Chicago, I mentioned that, and it's like, oh, you need to amend that, don't you? Like, absolutely not. I absolutely love the soil we have here in Kalamazoo, because you could grow so many different kinds of plants that I would love to do back when I was living in Chicago that I couldn't do. Completely different conditions. The other mistake we made early on was that we planted very sparsely. And that is a very common thing, especially you see this in commercial landscapes where you'll have this, you know, a sea of mulch with islands of plants spaced 3 feet apart. It's such a bizarre aesthetic. You never see anything like that in the wild. I'm not entirely sure where that came from and why it continues. I think it's just maybe just convention, but we're doing something different with native plants, with this kind of gardening. We are creating a community, a plant community. This is ecology. This isn't horticulture. So the plants need to interact with one another. It's a connection that they need. They've evolved with each other. They evolved with these certain conditions, and it's all part of a large puzzle that's inner workings that are really complicated. They need to work together. They can't be separated by mulch. And I think the other reason people use a lot of mulch is that maybe they think that we're going to cut back on weeds. That how long does that last though? We did a pretty thick layer early in June of 2005. The weeds are right back here. We probably added this mulch actually in fall of 2005. So mulch isn't a good substitute for a good ground cover. It's good to start off your plantings with some mulch, but you should never have to keep replenishing it. The other reason I think people don't really want to fill a space is maybe they're not confident in their choices, plant choices, so they want to be a bit conservative, or they don't want to spend a lot of money. If that's the case, then don't prepare the entire garden like I did here and be stingy on the planting. Maybe instead just work on this corner, but fill it. Do 12-inch centers, maybe in the least 18-inch centers. You need to fill it in. If you don't cover the ground, weeds will cover that ground for you. Nature does not like a vacuum. It will fill in the spot. You rarely see bare soil in natural plant communities. Okay, the last big error that we made was excessive irrigation. This is another common conventional gardening technique where we put out these drip lines, and I think we probably ran these drips every 3 days. That is way too much irrigation. Basically, you're wasting water and you're feeding weeds. These kinds of plants eventually become drought tolerant, but it's true, you definitely need to get them established early on. But they don't need as much water as you think they do. And in fact, you kind of want to stress them a bit. So if you're planting in the spring or the fall and the conditions are cool and wet, maybe set up I like to use one of those oscillating sprinklers, that kind of go back and forth like that. Set a timer for 45 minutes, let it run, and then do that only once every 7 days. If it's dry time of year that you're planting in like June, then maybe you're going to bump it up to about every 4 or 5 days. If you do more than that, you run the risk of roots of a lot of these plants. They don't like that much soil, that much irrigation. Okay, oops, keep doing that. Okay, the problem that I did with the prep is haunting me here in these photos. Excessively enriched soil plantings. There's very little competition in between these plants. Overwater them, over enrich the soil, and what you get are plants that grow way too tall. They don't have enough root structure support, so they just flop over. Rarely do you see this happen in a remnant prairie or a remnant oak savanna. And this is so common where you see asters and all sorts of plants being staked in gardens and fenced up, and kind of so many different tactics, which I've used all of them to try to keep these plants upright and looking good, but they just wanted to keep flopping over. Check this out. This is little blue stem here. You never see little blue stem flopping. It is such an upright plant. But in these conditions, it just can't handle that kind of soil. On the right here is prairie dock, which is admittedly one of the largest leaves of our prairie plants, but it's definitely not that large. This looks like I photoshopped it. It's like 3 times as large, and swallowing up my son here. I took this photo just like maybe a week before we moved to Kalamazoo. So even after 15 years of making that mistake on the prep phase of enriching the soil, we're still battling with plants that are growing way too tall and flopping over. Okay, this slide is kind of, I just added this recently because I think it's super important to talk about the vertical and temporal layers of a garden. This has been kind of a revelation to me because I did not know this portion of, so let me back up and talk about layers of garden. A lot of people have read Ptolemy books where he talks about, really high functioning habitat for your yard is to create layers, having a canopy layer, underneath that, the understory being the understory trees and shrubs, and then, the herbaceous layer, which is, our plants. So, but just recently, since moving to Kalamazoo, and found a lot of smart people who are in the ecology fields here in Kalamazoo. Somehow I really fell into a lot of really great people who taught me a lot about ecology right away. So people like Chad and Kristen at Hidden Savanna, and Steve Cato, and the groups that I work with at Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy. They kind of tuned me into a different way of thinking about gardening, thinking about it in terms of ecology and the various layers and the complexities of these systems, and to start observing in these kind of systems in the wild. And I started doing that, and I realized that I was thinking about it completely wrong. Up until about 2020, I thought about my garden as collection of plants that look that were side by side, and I think of it as on that plane, right? And you just have these plants all smushed together like that. But really, if you observe these plants in the wild, it's a lot more complex than that. They have vertical layers on the herbaceous layer. So the herbaceous layer is much more. There's a lot more happening than just plants side by side, and let's get into that. There's the ground cover base layer, seasonal layer, the structural layer, and the filler plants. And this is what you should be thinking about, and this is what I've been thinking about within the last couple of years of how to organize my designs so that we could create a system that is self-sustaining, that is going to need less maintenance, less management, and is just going to be a lot more interesting looking instead of something that is just kind of a hodgepodge mess. The most important layer that I've been thinking about lately is the ground cover base layer. And this is the layer that I've pretty much ignored for 15 years doing these gardens, something I've learned within the last 2 or 3 years. Approximately 50% of your plant lists are going to be devoted to your ground cover base layer. And I'm not talking about ground covers like conventional gardening, where you think about like a monoculture that you see. I see it all over town where you have like English ivy or lily of the valley or vinca vine. That's kind of a bully ground cover. I'm talking about a ground cover that is community minded, allows for other plants to grow within it. But they are low growing plants that function as living mulch. They provide root support for taller plants, control erosion, build soil, suppress weeds. Cool season ground covers are visible in spring, but they fade into the background underneath the taller plants of summer. So those cool season grasses, cool season base layers is what I really love to start with, because you need something to fight off those annual and biennial weeds that really want to get in early in the season. And sedges are a fantastic way of creating a living mulch. They are going to green up early. They're going to take up that space, cover that bare soil. Once they get established, that's going to be your mulch. You're not going to need to keep adding mulch. So let's think about something like sedges as a living, basically. And then the sedges will kind of start to go a little bit dormant during the midsummer, and that's where you want to have some warm season grasses that fill in that spot. And then the sedges kind of come back later in the fall. Basically, they're evergreen. It's a great tool to use sedges for a ground cover base layer. But you can also use flowering plants for the ground cover as well. Thinking like something like that spreads laterally, like wild strawberry or ragwort, different ragworts. Maybe wild ginger would work well. It depends on the situation. So that's an important layer. Seasonal layer is the most popular layer. That's the one that we probably plant most of our gardens with, but really you only need about 20 to 40% of your plant list should be the seasonal layer. The seasonal layer are the mid-height, seasonally flowering plants arranged in clumps, masses, and are successionally blooming throughout the growing. So so the most important part of this is that it's balanced, successionally blooming throughout the growing season. So you want something happening from spring all the way through fall. You know, there are very few plants that will bloom that long. Can't think of any that will bloom that long. So as one section of spring flowering plant starts to set seed, then you want something to kind of take over from there. So it's kind of like, movements in a symphony. It's just a dynamic, everything's changing. That's the cool thing about these kind of gardens. The structural layer, there aren't many plants in this layer. These are the plants that are going to be kind of like, they're kind of like the landmark of the garden. They're going to be tall. They're going to be very sturdy. The ones that are going to be kind of visible from kind of far away. So it's a way to kind of have your eye kind of rest among that biomass. You could pick out areas like I'm thinking in terms of flowering plants that would be a structural layer would be maybe Joe Pye weed, rattlesnake master can work. A lot of the silphiums work, something very sturdy, certain tall grasses, ironweed, definitely. But they can also be shrubs or trees. And then the last layer, this is an interesting layer. This is more talking about temporal layer. It's the filler plants. So, once we plant this garden, a lot of the plants some plants, that, especially the ones that are long-lived, aren't going to be doing much for the first year, maybe 2 or 3 years. Something like Baptisias, they take quite a while to get established. Same with lead plant. Not much is going on with those for a while because they are very, very long-lived. So it takes a while for them to get going. During that time, you need to cover that bare ground. And a great way to do this is to use short-lived species. You could use biennials or short-lived perennials. They fill the gap and they add first-year seasonal interest. These plants grow quickly. They filling in the bare spots during the early development stage of the garden, and they die off when longer-lived plants start to take off. I like to use Monarda punctata. It's got many different common names. I think it's dotted horse mint was the last I saw. The hyssops kind of are short-lived. Columbine can be short-lived. Cardinal flower for sure. A lot of people use black-eyed Susans. Not my favorite plant, but that would definitely work as a filler plant. Okay, so let's see how well I did with my layers. This is a year and a half after installation. I'm seeing a lot of mulch here. So a lot of bare ground. So basically no base layer, with the exception of this one sedge that I don't even remember planting. I wish there was, the whole garden was full of this sedge. If that were the case, I wouldn't have all these problems that I had that you'll see later. So you need a good base layer, and I do not have it here. Basically, what I have here is 100% seasonal layer, and it's an off-balance seasonal layer at that. Most of these plants are flowering late summer and fall. So, you know, April, May, June, this garden's looking pretty bleak. And then it starts to erupt in July and then through the fall. But you want to balance off those seasons. Clash of communities. This is super important. This is something Chad and I talk about frequently. Big mistakes that a lot of people make. Trying, just because you really love a plant and you don't have the conditions for it, but you still want to figure out a way to make it fit in your garden. Well, it's probably not going to work. If you have a plant that's has evolved with dry prairie or dry oak savanna, and you try to put in a wetland species in that same yard, one of those plants is not going to survive. So it's important to get to know your soil conditions, figure out how they drain, the kind of grade that you have in your landscape, get to know your sunlight conditions, and you plant specifically for those conditions. If you veer off too much, a lot of those plants just aren't going to survive. Again, we're talking about plant communities, not collection of individual plants. This is garden ecology. So, I learned this awesome technique or resource, I should say, from Kim during last month's presentation. If you want to get really nerdy about these communities, and you really want to figure out what your garden, your yard was pre-settlement, you could, if you're in Michigan, the Michigan Natural Features Inventory website has an interactive map where you could kind of hone in on your yard, and you could see what the pre-settlement plant community was like during that time before European settlement. And then that information, and there's another part of their website where it goes into detail about that specific plant community, and it provides you with plant lists of plants that grew and that were very common in those plant communities. So right there, you've got really great. I love to reference that and look at the plant lists and see what's still available. Sometimes some of those plants are, aren't even available in the nursery trade because pretty much gone. Because a lot of these plant communities are gone. So poor successional planning. Back then when I started this, and for many years after, I didn't even know that perennials had different lifespans. I just thought if there was a perennial, it just returns every year. I didn't know that some perennials were short-lived and others were long-lived. So if you need to know the lifespan of your plants. Rudbeckia hirta, black-eyed Susan is a biennial. I did not know that. After about 1 or 2 years, they disappear, and you need to have a plan of succession once those die off. Improper plant siting. Boom, right here. Aster. What's an aster doing right up front in a formal garden, in a small garden, right in the front yard? There's going to be problems with this, and it doesn't have much competition. Look at all this bare space that it's going to reseed all over the place. And the next slides will show you that's exactly what happened. Too many specimen species, not enough clumps and drifts. When I went to buy the plants at the Possibility Place sale, I was like a kid in a candy store. I read about these plants in the books and I thought, oh, here they are. Finally, I'm going to buy one of everything. And I went crazy and I put all, I thought that's what biodiversity is, right? You don't want to do that. It's just going to be a hodgepodge mess, and it's not really beneficial for our pollinators either. A lot of our pollinators, native bee species, can't fly more than 500 feet, some of them. So they want to have a short commute to their foraging plants. So if your plants are clumped together really well, they're able to access that nectar and pollen easily and quickly. Towering plants, front yard, formal garden, I wouldn't go higher than waist high for most of your plants, with the exception of the structural layer. And remember, the structural layer are plants that are few and far between. In this yard, there's probably only going to be about 3 structural plants. The other caveat to that is if you're looking to create more of like a buffer or like a living fence, and that's what I was attempting to do here, because I wanted to have a really nice buffer area right here at the back of the bed, because I didn't want to see, smell, or hear that road when we're sitting back here in our in our woodland garden. Okay, I'm going back to the ground cover layer because it's so important. And I stole this illustration from a really great book called Planting in a Post-Wild World, just because I love the way that it illustrates what's going on underground in the root systems when you have a densely planted ground cover base. Look at this. This is fibrous root systems. Most sedges have really amazing fibrous root systems. You're going to need that support for these taller plants. If you don't have this support here, something like Joe Pyeweed, these long roots, they're just kind of splay outwards. They're not going to have enough strength. That's why it's going to flop over. Common error. I can't even read the quote because it's hidden by some. Let's see if I could read it. The approach to ground cover is the single most important concept creating a functioning plant community. It's really, really important. Get that ground cover base layer pretty tight. And then you can experiment from there. Clash of plant communities. This photo is a fantastic illustration of a clash of plant communities. Even though it looks really beautiful, it's not going to last, and it did not last here. So the soil in this bed is mostly medium soil from probably from Mesa Prairie. So the plants that are going to do really well in these kind of conditions are purple coneflower, rattlesnake master, there's ironweed back here, Culver's root, cut plant. I had some other silphiums that love this kind of soil. What else? Oh, Rudbeckia subtomentosa. I don't know the common name for that one. I think it's, I don't know. Anyways, those kind of plants are going to do really well. And they did. They lived for a very long time in this garden. The plants that look like they're doing well here fade off after a couple of years. Actually, Knotty Onion is going to do really well in these conditions as well. Lanceleaf Coreopsis is meant for dry prairies or dry oak savannas. They really need well-drained soil. Same is true for New Jersey tea, June grass, side oats grama can only handle, it really likes dry soil. Butterfly milkweed and pale purple coneflower. These plants are meant for a different community than I have here in this yard. A lot of these plants faded really quickly, 1 or 2 years. Butterfly milkweed held on for about 3 or 4 years and eventually started to disappear. I had some back here, they just disappeared. They should be living a lot longer than that. They're a long-lived plant. Get to know your soil conditions and put the right plant in the right spot. Improper plant siting. This is what I was talking about with the asters that just were not placed properly and did not have enough competition. This was just one New England aster planted in spring of 2005. A year and a half later, look away. It went crazy. That's what happens when it has no competition and it's free to sow seeds all over the place. But it's kind of a disaster to have this right in the front of the bed. High traffic, foot traffic on the sidewalk. It's flopping, it's going to flop over into the sidewalk. And, you know, for the most part, asters don't look all that great for most of the growing season. They look pretty weedy. In October, they look fantastic, and I don't get me wrong, I love asters, I love goldenrods. Not all asters and goldenrods obviously are treated equally. There's so many different kinds in those families, but for a small yard, especially small front yard, you want to limit the amount of asters and goldenrods and there's other aggressive cedars that you would want to put towards the back and limit how many you put in there. This looks great in October, but the problem is this is where my path was. Completely flopped over. I completely lost my path. Plants are too tall and lack height diversity. This was a really weird strip of lawn before. Oops. How do I go back? Whoops. There we go. Before we moved in, it was like a weird lawn strip, and then we added these tall plants, and they're just flopping over. I'm wrestling with these every year, flopping over into the drive, flopping over into the sidewalk. Same is true here, but you don't see it because we've got this little metal fence that's holding them back. There are a lot more options than these tall plants in this small space. Okay, in addition to the preparation errors and the design errors, I made some management errors. Basically, I created a weed farm by over-enriching the soil and disturbing the soil and overwatering. And then I kept this vicious cycle of weeds continuing for 15 years because every spring and summer, I had so many weeds that I was constantly pulling. But every time you pull a weed, you're doing soil again. So you're opening up the soil to the possibility of pioneer weed species inhabiting that spot, and they absolutely will. So what do I do to combat that? More mulch. So instead, what I really should have here is a really great ground cover, and that would prevent those weeds from taking off. So the problem with adding mulch to combat weeds is, for one, the mulch is going to decompose, so the weeds are going to break through anyways. that decomposition is going to change the composition of your soil, making it even more rich, making it even more fertile habitat for weeds. So it's a terrible vicious cycle. I was battling that with for many years. Okay, this is 2 years after install. Things are growing pretty well, but poor plant sighting, I lost my path. 2 years later, I completely lost my path. Those asters and goldenrods are growing really tall, flopping over. Everything's kind of getting a little out of control here. Okay, so I feel like my wife was saying, you're being too hard on yourself and pointing out all these mistakes. So I put this slide in here because despite all these things that I'm saying, all these mistakes that I made, it's still a wonderful garden and much better than what's going on here. Monocultures. I took this photo in the summer of 2007, maybe, I can't remember when this was. And then we had a terrible drought that year. So to keep lawns looking lush and green, lawns are cool season grasses. They want to go dormant. So you're constantly fighting nature. And that's why everyone has to constantly irrigate lawns in the midsummer, especially during a drought. So my neighbors were, they had their sprinklers out every day. I did not put one sprinkler out here during that whole summer. Did not do any manual irrigation, and it's just thriving. And it's a thriving, functional ecosystem, little tiny nature preserve amidst all this dead zone. All right, this photo is from 2015, 10 years after installation. This is okay. So I'm sorry, what'd you say? How much time do we have?
So it's 8 o'clock now.
Oh, wow.
We can go till 8:15, but if you can wrap up your talk in 5 or 6, we have a number of questions.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay. Okay, here we are, 2018. I think some of my goals are kind of getting completed. Ecologically functioning, high aesthetic value. Let's move through a little quicker. I included this plant in here because it's a perfect plant to use as an edge species. It's prairie smoke. Looks great in the spring when not many prairie plants are in bloom. But then even after that, the foliage is pretty much evergreen and it looks great throughout the year. Okay. Flora fauna connections. I'll scroll through these quickly. Beneficial predator insects. You want those in your garden. Plant rattlesnake master for that. Finches are one of the few birds that feed their young seeds. So stuff like silphiums and dahlia and coneflowers work well. Baby waxwings on our pagoda dogwood. If you build it, they will come. Our yard was a little tiny nature preserve. So many interesting creatures visiting. Even at night, our garden looked great. Culver's root illuminated by the street lamp. This is my woodland garden. I'm just going to scroll through it really quickly because I kept some slides in here just to show you what it looks like back beyond the pocket prairie. Geraniums did really well back there. Pagoda dogwood is perfect understory tree for a small yard. Mayapple succeeded after it goes kind of drab in the summertime. Have a replacement with it with Joe Pye weed. Perfect succession there. This is the transition from the pocket prairie into our woodland with Virgin's Bower. You pass through that gate and it opens up to here. All right, so if I were going to design this garden, if I were hired to design this garden today, what differently. So I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Keep the same format with the path going vertically or from the sidewalk into the woodland garden, but then I would create a perpendicular path so the postal worker can pass through there. And then I'm creating my layers that I talk about. Ground cover, the green is a matrix of 3 different kinds of sedge species: Carex blanda, Carex brevier, Carex eburnia. And then from there, you create your seasonal layers, structural layers. And over here in that weird looking little strip, instead of having tall grass prairie plants flopping all over the place, I decided to do prairie dropseed and nodding onion intervals all the way through with a simple structural marsh blazing star popping through. So, okay, that was the speed to the end, the kick at the end there. And now we could go into questions if you want.
Okay, Mike, I've been monitoring the chat. Mm-hmm. And to start with, we have quite a number of questions about sedges.
Yeah.
So questions include, can sedges be intermingled with the seasonal layer or planted closely around them? Will they do well next to the road? Are some actually undesirable because they're too vigorous?
Well, yeah. A lot of answers to a lot of those questions. It depends on the species. You definitely want to make sure that you're using the correct sedge for your condition. For your conditions, there's a lot of people think of sedges as being like a wetland species, but there's pretty much for any kind of condition. There aren't tons for dry, full sun, but there are quite a few. And I like to start with, I start by putting my structural layer plants down and then my seasonal layers. And then through all of, once I put those plugs down when I'm laying out all my plants, then I put all the sedges or the ground cover around all that pretty tight, 12-inch centers from the other seasonal plants. So yeah, they intermingle great. They're a perfect ground cover for intermingling with seasonal plants. And yes, they work well next to an edge. I mean, it depends on the species, right? There's, I'm thinking of a full sun sedge that might be a little too tall for the edge. Would be like Carex bicknellii, probably too tall. You want that, maybe it's a robust grower. You want to put that more towards the center. But something like eburnia, super tiny, cute little sedge, you want that towards next to your path because it's just a beautiful tiny little plant, and they'll fill in really well. And these plants aren't going to get, is going back to the idea of competition. This is healthy competition. That these, if you some plants, if they get too aggressive, it's usually because they have competition and they're free to roam. So yeah, Carex pennsylvanica might take off. I don't know. It really depends on the situation. But if it has a healthy competition, it's going to stay in place and it's going to be it's going to work well with the community.
So one final question about sedges is whether they are deer resistant.
Absolutely. The only rabbits tend to nibble on them, but if you have a lot of them, they kind of get overwhelmed. Rabbits aren't going to decimate all of your sedges. And again, we're talking about planting a lot of sedges. If you're doing 12-inch centers, you're going to be wanting to buy flats of a sedge species, not just individual pots.
So a couple of questions about resources. We put in the chat the link for the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. Yeah. But a couple of folks have asked about where do you go to learn about what is the lifespan of a particular perennial, or what kind of soil you would find in your yard?
Oh, those are really good questions. I always thought that was an element that should be included in plant when you go to like a nursery, like if you go to the Prairie Moon or Prairie Nursery, and they have all sorts of information about these species, but they don't talk about the lifespan of them, which I thought that's weird. They should include that information. It's just, doing your research on it, really. I have the books that I really love. Actually, I have them right here. The Planting in a Post-Wild World. These books are kind of talking more about the communities, Living Landscape with Ptolemy and Rick Dark, and then The Garden Revolution. Oops, I lost the cover, by Larry Weiner. Talks about these kinds of complex layers. But when it comes to individual species, maybe more of the online searches are best for that. I do have another book called Native Plants of the Midwest. Fantastic book. Highly recommend this book. And it breaks down a lot of, it goes by individual species. Actually, that's the book you should use.
Another question we had was, hold on, here we go. Was whether you reseeded your lawn with no-mow grass.
I've never, I don't know anything about that species. It's funny, I've been seeing that for 15 years about no-mow lawn, but I've never actually seen a no-mow lawn. I'm sorry, I don't know anything about no-mow lawn.
Yeah. We have other questions about some of the flowering plants. Do you cut your asters back in July?
So when I had that problem in Chicago with the plants growing way too tall, yes, I would knock those babies back like 3 or 4 times during the summer to stunt their growth so they wouldn't get so tall. But the reason that happened was because the soil was just too rich and there was just not enough competition. If you have enough competition and you didn't amend your soil, the asters should be fine. I rarely see, whenever I see asters growing in the wild, they're not ridiculously tall. But if they are getting tall in your yard, definitely you could stunt their growth by cutting them. I cut them back halfway in July, for sure. You could go even further than that.
Another question was about your black-eyed Susans and whether they reseed themselves. Do they stick around a long time?
It's a biennial species, so it really should. They die off after a year or two. They will reseed. If the soil's disturbed, and you could kind of do that manually by kicking back the mulch and kind of sprinkling the seeds around. But the parent plant is definitely going to die off after a year or two. And then if the hardy long-lived plants are in that spot, then they're going to be the black-eyed Susan is going to get outcompeted by those taller plants, and they're just going to fade away. But that's the purpose of those plants. They're not meant to stick around for too long. They're early successional species.
Here's another question about the use of yarrow as a ground cover. Is that something that you would recommend?
I have a friend who uses that in his designs. I've never used it myself. But I'm sure that could probably work. I don't really know how, I don't know too much about that species, honestly.
And so we're coming up to 8:15, so I think this will be our last question. Mm-hmm. If you've already made the mistake of amending your soil, what do you suggest you do?
Probably give the plants more competition, plant more plants, really, because if there aren't enough plants there, those root systems are just kind of gonna spread out, and they're just not gonna have support, and they're just gonna keep doing that. So pack it in, probably pack it in with more of a base layer. It's probably the best idea. The other reason I really like base layer and have kind of subtle base layers like sedges is because in a design point of view, it kind of creates a really easy on the eyes, calming element to the garden. Whereas, instead of having tons of seasonal blooms happening like a riot, I like to have that calming sedge green at the base. It's kind of, if you see it in a garden, you'll notice it, and it just looks really fantastic.
Okay, I think we've done as many questions as we reasonably can. Jason, do you want to say some final words?
Sure. So thank you, Mike, for your presentation and enlightening us on some do's and don'ts and trial and error, and showing your beautiful photos of the spaces that you've created over the years. So definitely appreciate your presentation tonight, and for all of you for sticking around a little bit later and bearing with us through some technical difficulties. And appreciate you being here tonight. We look forward to seeing you next month, March 22nd, at the Portage District Library. Have a great night.